what it means for protecting ITAR-controlled technical data in the cloud. My name is Stephanie Bailey from Perspecsys, and I'll be your moderator for today. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. First, this webinar will be recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording and presentation within 2 business days following this webcast. Second, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you do have any questions during the session, please enter them in the Q&A section on your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And last, this webinar is best viewed in full screen mode. You can do this by clicking on the icon in the upper right-hand corner in your screen. So let's get started. Joining me today are Robert Slack and Eric McClafferty from Kelley Drye. Robert Slack is an associate in the DC office with his practice focus on export controls, anti-corruption, and sanctions matters. Eric McClafferty is a partner in the firm with his focus on his practice on international trade and has substantial experience in export controls and compliance, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases. Our last speaker is Gerry Grealish, Chief Marketing Officer of Perspecsys. Gerry is responsible for defining and executing Perspecsys' marketing and product vision. He is a frequent author and speaker on cloud data security issues across industry events and publications, as well as a member of the International Association of Privacy Professionals and the Cloud Security Alliance. So first, just a quick overview of the agenda. Kelley Drye is going to walk us through an overview of the ITAR regulations and the impact they have on cloud applications. In addition, they'll provide a summary of key points of the State Department advisory opinion on transfer of tokenized ITAR-controlled technical data to the cloud. Then Gerry is going to provide a high-level explanation of how companies can use tokenization to protect sensitive cloud data, and then again we'll open it up for question and answer. Some of the key takeaways we hope you get from today. First, demonstrate how organizations dealing with ITAR-controlled data now have a clear path to be able to use cloud-based applications. Second, what steps and safeguards agencies and enterprises need to have in place to make sure they comply with ITAR restrictions and understand how tokenization can help with that. Third, gain a better understanding of what cloud data protection gateways are and what role they can play in preserving the functionality of a cloud application. And last, what other cloud access security broker technologies can also help. So let's get started with Eric from Kelley Drye. Eric?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're here today to talk about the Perspecsys advisory opinion and what it means for ITAR-controlled tech data and the cloud. First, to get started, just a couple of very standard disclaimers. This presentation is an overview of a rapidly evolving subject, and so don't take this presentation as the final word. It's a topic where people have to pay attention and keep up with the evolving issue. Secondly, our presentation today is not legal advice regarding any particular approach or issue that you have. It's a background presentation, and as such, it doesn't create any kind of an attorney-client relationship with anybody on the phone, which I think is pretty obvious to everybody, but it makes sense to say it out loud. And we're here to discuss the advisory opinion and the regulations. We're going to leave the discussion of the particulars of the software and its capabilities to Perspecsys and Gerry Grealish. They're the experts in that. So what happened exactly? Perspecsys asked the State Department, U.S. State Department, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, DDTC, for an advisory opinion confirming that tokenization can be used to process and store ITAR data in an international cloud application without an export license issued for each instance of that. And DDTC issued an advisory opinion confirming that a license exemption could be used under certain circumstances to do that. And just Rob's going to get into more detail about the advisory opinion, but I do want to read just part of that advisory opinion to you. And that says, in accordance with the license exemption, I'm not quoting directly here at this point, but in accordance with the license exemption, 125.4b9, and now I am quoting, tokenization may be used to process controlled technical data using cloud computing applications without a license, even if the cloud computing provider moved tokenized data to servers located outside the U.S. So that represents a change in DTC's approach to this limited license exception. Previously, the agency had indicated to us and others that a license would be required to move ITAR-controlled tech data outside the U.S. in a cloud application like that. Okay, next slide. We're going to talk very, very briefly in a very high level about certain aspects of the international traffic in arms regulations, which are the regulations administered by the U.S. Department of State, Director of Defense Trade Controls. Those regulations are found in 22 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 120 through 130. The U.S. munitions list, USML, lists specific items that are controlled under the regulations in Part 121. As indicated, these regulations are administered by DDTC, enforced by a variety of different U.S. government agencies, including DDTC, the FBI, ICE, Customs Border Protection, and others. The ITAR regulate the export and re-export of defense articles, which includes physical goods, technical data, software, and services. And today we're here to talk about the movement of technical data onto the cloud and its treatment on the cloud. There are other important types of export control regulations out there: Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Energy, the Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security administers the Export Administration Regulations. So there are a variety of other regulations out there that people need to pay attention to, but today our focus really is on the ITAR. So let's talk a little bit about technical data under the ITAR. It's defined as very broadly as information which is required for the design, development, production, manufacture, assembly, operation, repair, testing, maintenance, or modification of defense articles. And it can include such things as blueprints, drawings, photographs, plans, instructions, or documentation. And the scope of technical data is actually very broad, as you can see in those examples of the types, the forms that it shows up in are limited, and it can go on and on. Tech data under the ITAR also includes classified information related to defense articles, defense services, or 600 series items on the Commerce Control List of the Export Administration Regulations. And it's important to recognize when we talk about classified data that there is another set of regulations, NISPOM, which covers the dissemination and treatment of classified information. Sometimes people get confused and think NISPOM focuses on the export control regs or covers the export control regulations, or that the ITAR covers classified information. There's certainly overlap, but they are different sets of regulations, and you have to pay attention to both. Software directly related to defense articles also classified as technical data under the regulations, and data under an invention secrecy order, which is a part of the intellectual property process or registration creation process, is also tech data. Let's talk a little bit about the basic rule under the ITAR on the next slide. Articles subject to the ITAR, including technical data, typically require a license or the use of a license exemption to be exported from the U.S. or released to foreign nationals in the U.S. And when I talk about exported from the U.S., really when it comes to technical data, I think it's important to think about technical data crossing a border, the U.S. border, leaving the United States. And it can do so in a wide variety of forms and formats. So somebody could pick up a telephone, make a telephone call, an international telephone call, let's say, to Germany, and start discussing ITAR control technical data with someone in Germany. That would be an export of that technical data outside of the United States. Sending an email containing ITAR technical data, putting something in a package, technical data in a document or drawing in an express mailing package, a FedEx package, and mailing it outside the U.S. could be an export. Placing ITAR tech data on the cloud outside the U.S. is also considered to be an export of that data. Another way to run into these tech data rules is releasing controlled ITAR tech data to foreign nationals in the United States. So that's a very, very brief overview of some of the relevant issues related to tech data and the ITAR. Rob Slack from my office is going to dive a little bit more deeply now into the treatment of tech data on the cloud and some of the specific aspects of the Perspecsys advisory opinion.
Thanks, Eric. So I want to cover a couple of things, discuss background on cloud computing under the ITAR, discuss how the State Department had traditionally viewed cloud computing, and how the advisory opinion has shifted that approach a little bit and its impact on cloud computing with ITAR controlled technical data. Okay, so the next slide here, we have two images. One is a drawing of a fighter jet, and the other one a drawing of a very old naval vessel. And basically what happens when you transfer data to the cloud is that you're transferring them to a network of servers. And your cloud computing provider may transfer data to and among those servers based on demand and other criteria. Okay, on the next slide, we introduce kind of the two classic cloud computing problems. The first is that the cloud computing provider may shift your data from a server in the United States to a server outside the United States. And as Eric mentioned, that's an export, and that requires authorization under the ITAR, either in the form of a license or the use of a license exemption. The second classic problem is foreign national access to data stored on the cloud. And this problem applies both to clouds that are wholly domestic, so all of the servers are located in the U.S., and clouds where some of the servers are located outside the U.S. And the typical example is a cloud computing provider's employee, maybe a foreign national, and they may have actual or hypothetical access to the data you've stored on their cloud servers. In that case, the State Department considers that release or hypothetical release of information to be an export, which requires either a license or a license exemption. All right, on the next slide, we just illustrate kind of what this can look like. So you host data to the cloud in the United States, to a server there, and then your cloud computing provider, without your knowledge, may hit a button and transfer it to its other servers. And so here we have servers in 4 countries. So merely by loading your data to the domestic cloud or the server in the U.S., you have actually had 4 instances of exports that would require authorization from the State Department. I want to call out here the fact I put a server in China. Even under the advisory opinion, technical data cannot be transferred to China. They're subject to U.S. arms embargo. All right, the second problem I have illustrated with Mr. Bean. So one of my favorite examples. So assume Mr. Bean is an employee of your cloud computing provider. He has access to the server located in the United States that's housing your controlled technical data. When he accesses that data, it's deemed to be an export to his home country, the United Kingdom. So in total, just by loading your data on the cloud, you've accomplished 5 exports, all of which require authorization from the State Department. Okay. So before for the advisory opinion on the next slide, the State Department, prior to issuing the advisory opinion, took the basic position that if you're hosting data on the global cloud, so on servers outside the United States, or if you're hosting data on a U.S. server where there are domestic cloud, where there are foreign national employees, you needed a license. So you needed a license, and critically, you needed a license regardless of whether the data was in the clear form, so in clear text or in the clear. So if you're hosting the actual image of the fighter jet drawing on the cloud, or if you're sending obfuscated data to the cloud. And so I've used an example here of a token value that would be hosted on the cloud. And as Gerry will get into, Perspecsys tokenization basically converts the drawing into a tokenized format. So in the past, the State Department said you actually needed to obtain a license to host either the drawing or the token on the cloud for each instance. What happened when the advisory opinion was issued? And on the next slide here, and even the one after, let's get to the punchline. So the punchline of the advisory opinion, the Perspecsys went to the State Department and essentially asked, please treat tokenized data differently than you would treat data in the clear. So, we made an argument and said the token value is hosting a token value in the cloud is quite different from hosting that drawing in the clear on the cloud. And the State Department came back and said, you can use tokenization under certain circumstances to host technical data in the cloud without obtaining a license. And there are essentially two criteria you had to comply with. One, you had to comply with an existing license exemption. And the second criteria was that you had to use sufficient means to prevent unauthorized access to the clear text technical data throughout all phases of your use of the cloud. And Eric's going to talk a bit more about what sufficient means really means. On the next slide, we can look a little bit more detail about the advisory opinion's authorization. It essentially says the same thing. It's taken from the language in the DDTC's letter to the company. I just want to highlight here that the advisory opinion applies so long as sufficient means are taken throughout all phases of the transfer, so including transmission, storage, and receipt of data, and so long as all aspects of the existing license exception are complied with. And the exemption that the State Department chose is at 22 CFR 125.4 B9. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what this license exception means. So and there's actually a drawing that I put up here to kind of explain as we go along. The license exception, its traditional use was to allow U.S. persons to send controlled technical data to other U.S. persons overseas who are employees of either a U.S. company or the U.S. government, subject to certain restrictions. And the picture illustrates kind of the traditional use here. So the ITAR, an older set of regulations, were written well before cloud computing was a concern. And I have two Americans who are employees of the U.S. government in the United States and Germany. And the exemption would allow U.S. person number one in the U.S. to put together a package of ITAR-controlled data, physical package, put it in the U.S. mail. The U.S. mail transfers that package to the German Postal Service. Those are the nice folks on the bikes there. And the German Postal Service would deliver that package to the second U.S. person in Germany. And what's kind of key here is, throughout the phases of this transfer, the foreign national persons actually took possession of the ITAR-controlled data, right? The German post office and German citizens took possession of that package of material and delivered it to the U.S. person in Germany, the ultimate recipient. And so the State Department utilized this license exemption and expanded it to digital transfers under the cloud. And on the next slide, we'll talk about some of the license exemption restrictions. These apply when you're utilizing the exemption under the traditional aspect, where you're sending physical technical data, and also under the cloud. And I want to just highlight some of these. The first is that the exemption does not apply to proscribed destinations. These are countries subject to arms embargoes, and I have the current list listed out here. This list changes with U.S. foreign policy, of course, and I've bolded China there. China is obviously a very big concern for the U.S. government, and transfers of technical data either in the clear or in tokenized form are generally prohibited. The second condition is that the exemption can only be used to when data is sent, received, and used by U.S. persons who are either employed by a U.S. company or the U.S. government. And it's important to point out that the U.S. person, if you have a U.S. person overseas receiving the data, they have to be an employee of a company incorporated in the United States. It does not apply to persons who are employees of a foreign subsidiary of a U.S. company. The rest of these are smaller points, but just want to hit them quickly. The exemption does not apply to persons generally ineligible under the ITAR. These are folks who have been convicted of violating export control laws, debarred parties, and others. Technical data hosted on the cloud pursuant to the exemption cannot be used for foreign production purposes or to provide technical assistance to a foreign party. And finally, classified data is subject to the additional restrictions in the NISPOM, as Eric mentioned earlier. Okay, the next slide we start to talk about developing what sufficient means really means. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
So as we mentioned earlier, sufficient means is not really defined in the regulation, so that term is not set in stone. But we want to talk about some of the important considerations we think people should take into account in putting together a data security system with the aim of meeting requirements of the advisory opinion and the license exemption 125.4b9. First, technical data should be secured in the U.S. on servers restricted from foreign person access. So the actual clear text, tech data can't be reviewed by foreign nationals either located in the U.S. or outside the U.S. It's got to be secured in the U.S. In this tokenization process, tokens got to be generated in such a way as to prevent any link between the clear text data and the token. And Gerry's going to talk about how their process implements that process, how their software implements that process. Third, the entire tokenization should be housed in the U.S. Tokenization system should be housed in the U.S. and subject to security requirements at least as stringent as those applied to controlled technical data, and in fact likely far more restricted, and Gerry will talk about their approach to that. The system should be configured to only enable authorized U.S. persons to gain access to the controlled tech data when in the clear when using supported cloud applications. So the whole system is set up so that only authorized persons can actually view the clear text ITAR data. So how do you achieve that? Let's take the next slide. There's a couple, well, one thing that's really very clear is that the data owner is responsible for securing clear text data. And we've talked about some of the standards that you've got to achieve in doing that. Now, a couple of approaches to this include taking your proposed data security system to the agency and seeking to have the agency approve that system to handle that tech data in your particular application involving the countries where you want to store the data. Another approach, because sufficient means is not defined, is for companies to self-determine if their system meets the sufficient means standard. And the agency has really not provided any kind of direction here And with many things, the agency, DTC, relies on exporters to achieve the standards and to meet the requirements of the license exception on their own. But as indicated, people could also approach the agency and ask for some guidance. Okay, so sufficient means is not the clearest concept in the world, but Gerry is going to describe now for you the Perspecsys approach and the use of tokenization to put ITAR tick data in the cloud as described by the agency in the advisory opinion. So I'm going to turn it over now to Gerry Grealish.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Rob. I want to start off my section with just a bit of a recap on one of the ideas that Rob mentioned, because it sets the stage for why Perspecsys approached the State Department EDTC in the first place. Over the past year or two, we've been getting approached by organizations that are dealing with ITAR-controlled data about their desire to move to cloud applications, the same reasons that anybody else would want to move to the cloud: efficiency, benefits, cost benefits, etc. But they face one or two challenges, both described here. The idea is, of course, on number one, as Rob described, data could move to an overseas data center. Even if the primary data center of the cloud provider is in the U.S., once people read the contracts and the SLAs, they often find that in backup or redundant situations, the data may flow outside of the U.S. So clearly, given what Rob and Eric described, that's a problem. The other issue, number two, is even if you can work with the cloud provider to put into the service level agreements that the data will remain resident in the U.S., the issue that many organizations run into is that the data of the cloud provider will not be willing to specify that only U.S. citizens will have access to the information. So many of the cloud providers might have actually foreign nationals working with them here in the States, or more often than not, resources offshore that take on the task of grooming the data, data hygiene, maintenance, those sorts of things. So both problematic given the move to the cloud. So my team and the rest of the organization, we started to contemplate the challenge. In the States, we have been helping organizations comply with regulations such as CGIS, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, PCI, DSS, HIPAA, those sorts of things. But overseas, we've been helping organizations in countries like Germany, the UK, France, Australia, Canada deal with a class of problems that are known as data residency or data sovereignty. And in those particular countries, and many more like them, the challenge there is that it's very difficult for them to ship data across a border to a U.S. cloud. And each of the countries has their own set of regulations around that. But more often than not, those countries or those enterprises use the technique of ours inside of our gateway, as I'll describe, called tokenization, to satisfy those requirements, keep that sensitive data inside of their own environment or border while still adopting a US-based cloud. So we made the connection that in many ways the challenge here with ITAR controlled data was similar, but kind of the reverse situation. The information needed to stay in the US and or be only viewed by US organizations. And that's the background, the connection by which we started to work and submitted into the EDTC for the advisory opinion on the use of tokenization in cloud. And really from a use case perspective, there's two challenges or two areas that companies came to us with in terms of their use of cloud applications. And let me just comment, when I talk about cloud and the enterprises that have approached us, it's typically more around public cloud SaaS applications. So the use of something like a Salesforce.com or a Force.com for customer support, or something like a ServiceNow for customer support. So these are multi-tenant public cloud applications. And the challenge is the compliance teams and the information technology teams dove into it was things such as documents that could be attached to certain customer files inside of these cloud applications for the reasons Rob and Eric mentioned earlier, or also these more free text fields, description fields, comment fields, where people could put in sensitive data, ITAR-controlled information. And as Rob described at a high level, and I'll get into more detail, the idea that we submitted to the State Department is that that information could be replaced by tokens so that the information never actually left the controlled information in the clear never left the control of the original organization. And we'll talk about how we do that and what some of the challenges are if you're doing that in a cloud-based environment. And as Eric mentioned, a key part is not only the replacement of the information with the token, but to ensure that sufficient means are in place that only the appropriate authorized individuals have the means to detokenize. So tokenize is to basically replace the original information with a token. The reverse process detokenization needs to be there to ensure that only authorized people can bring the information back into the clear. And as was mentioned, it's not just at a certain phase of the life of that data, it's through all phases. So transmission, storage, receipt, processing. So this is where the idea of a gateway comes into play. Gartner calls this space cloud data protection gateways. Forrester now calls it the same. And the idea is that only a gateway will allow a subset of users that the enterprise will deem as authorized to be able to pull the information back into the clear. It's the gateway and the database associated with it is the means by which the information is brought back into the clear. Somebody who's unauthorized, whether that be a third party or let's say the employees of the cloud provider themselves, if they were to access, let's say, a particular document in this example, all they would see is the replacement token, so clearly not usable in any way, shape, or form. So just to kind of bring that concept into more of a real-life situation, let's say that somebody's using Salesforce as a customer portal to provide support for some people that they're working with, and the information is ITAR-controlled information. In this particular situation, a document is associated with that file. If the internal users access the cloud system via the gateway has the means to pull the information back into the clear, so the internal users are none the wiser that this information was never truly put out into an uncontrolled environment, because the detokenization process happens behind the scenes inside of their own environment. And again, somebody who's not an authorized user, again, they would just see replacement information for anything that was tokenized that needed to be secured because it was ITAR-controlled information. One question that I frequently get asked then in the beginning of a discussion with somebody would be, okay, how does it work in practice? And clearly this is a high-level scenario, but just to set the stage, typically what will occur will be there'll be a data governance sort of process by which there's an understanding inside the organization on what specific data aspects or data types could make it into this cloud application that would be ITAR controlled. So that's step number one, assessment of the data, understanding the fields of the cloud application, and then what sort of data could make its way into those fields. And from that, you wind up with a set of fields that you need to, in this situation, tokenize to ensure that the ITAR-controlled information would never leave the environment. Step two, there's a set of dashboards and policy and administration tools within the software that allow security and compliance professionals to specify which fields in the cloud application can flow through clear and which fields within the cloud application need to be tokenized so the information never goes out to the cloud provider in the clear. Think about that as almost a staging environment, and then what occurs is in step three, the gateway is deployed in a production environment, so all access both up to the cloud and then back from the cloud in terms of a read operation occurs through the gateway. And only specific identified authorized users are able to access the gateway to get to the cloud information. So clearly there's a lot more detailed steps beyond it than that, but at a high level, think about those three steps in the operations model. One question I frequently get asked, because people will be familiar with encryption technologies, and they know that there's different forms of encryption with different sorts of validations and proofs. The same idea is true in tokenization. Tokenization has been widely used in some specific industries, like the payment card industry. PCI DSS standards have published different guidelines on the basically token generation creation methods. And an important thing to highlight as you're looking at token generation method, and quite honestly an important part of what we submitted in a lot of our background documentation to the State Department, was the idea that some tokens can be created in essence stronger than other tokens. So some tokens can be created via what's called a mathematical hash, where there's a mathematical link between the token and the original value. But there's another approach, which is the approach that's inside of our solution, and again was part of our submission, where the token has no intrinsic relationship back to the original data. So there's not this idea of a mathematical link or a key that brings the token back to the clear text form. So it's a sequentially generated token that gets arbitrarily assigned to a document, which is an important part for those that are kind of look beyond and get into the security apparatus. It's an important factor for a lot of folks as they look at the technology. As I mentioned before, it's a gateway, but there is actually a token vault that's associated with it. And that token vault, think of it as just an Oracle database that would be inside of the enterprise's ITAR-controlled data center, just like any other database might be there. And that database itself can be hardened and encrypted as well. I just wanted to touch on two use cases that have come up in many of my discussions. The first one, I think about it, or I often call it kind of restricted access. Kind of a busy slide. I took some of the builds off because of performance reasons. But the idea hopefully will be apparent to the folks that are attending the webinar. There's certain individuals within your organization that should have access to the information. Other individuals should not be able to basically detokenize. So there's always the idea of people on the cloud side of the equation on the right side shouldn't be able to see it, but also people inside of your organization should not be able to see the information in the clear. So in this situation, the New York compliance team is set up to be able to access the information in the clear. Also, our friends Fred Jones and Joe Pringle down in Philadelphia also have the ability to access the information, but all other employees should not be able to access the information. So the controls are there that you can actually just block them from being able to get to the cloud altogether, but just to illustrate the point, if they were some way to get to the cloud, the information, again, would not be detokenized. So, again, it would have no ability or no meaningful value to them. The other one, a little bit more complicated, but it's come up quite a bit, I think specific to applications like Salesforce and ServiceNow, where companies might be using something like a Remedy or one of those sort of applications to provide customer service, IT support to their customers. And many of these organizations are looking to move to these cloud applications like ServiceNow or Salesforce for the efficiency cost gains. But the challenge again is, there's a situation, one in particular that I'll pick, called email to case, where somebody who's on the right side of the red line, so the customer or partner, number one, needs to file, let's say, a customer support case into the company, the weapon systems manufacturer. We'll call them Acme, on the lower side, on the left-hand side of the red arrow. So in that situation, if there's a document, let's say, that's ITAR controlled that needs to be part of that dialogue back and forth between Acme and the customer partner, how would you use a cloud application? Well, the gateway can play a very important, critical role there, actually. The customer, the cloud infrastructure and the data center of the Acme company is set up in such a way that the customer actually comes in through, their access to the cloud is through the gateway in Acme company. And the Perspecsys gateway in this particular situation is set up such that ITAR-controlled information such as attachments on email to case files are replaced with tokens before they would go out to the cloud environment. So the other person who's critical in this situation to be able to see the information is not only the sender, but of course the person on your customer support team. They would be set up so that they would have access to that same information via the gateway, so they could actually pull it up in the clear and then engage with the customer partner in the appropriate way to solve the problem. Hopefully that makes sense. So with that, Stephanie, just want to hand it back over to you. Hopefully I gave people a sense of how the technologies work together.
Great. Thanks, Gerry, Rob, and Eric. We really appreciate what you've shared with us today. So just wanted to quickly go over some of the key takeaways we started at the beginning of the webinar with. So we hope today that we've demonstrated how organizations dealing with ITAR-controlled data now have a clear path to be able to use cloud-based applications. We shared with you what steps and safeguards agencies and enterprises need to have in place to make sure they comply with ITAR restrictions and understand how tokenization can help. We also hope you've gained a better understanding of what a cloud data protection gateway is and what role it can play in preserving functionality of a cloud application. And last, you learned what other cloud access security broker technologies can also help. So now we're going to open it up to question and answer. We'll get to as many questions as we can during the session. All you need to do is enter a question in the box on the screen, and if we don't get to everything today, we will answer them offline by one of our speakers. So let's start with the first question. Eric, Rob, this is for you. What are the rules surrounding some of the domestic clouds?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So the rules for the domestic cloud are, the quick answer is there are no rules. The State Department has not released specific guidance on the domestic cloud, but the rule is essentially a sufficient means approach. So if you're hosting data solely on a U.S. cloud, on data centers solely in the U.S., sufficient means must be used to secure that data from foreign national access. So you would need to implement a complete security system to ensure there was no inadvertent release of controlled data to a foreign national without a license.
And, you know, people on the phone who are not familiar with the ITAR should know that, like a lot of other export control regulations, it's a strict liability regime. So to have a civil violation of the regulations and potentially incur a penalty, you need to avoid violations of the regulations. So you don't have to kind of sit in a back room and scheme away about how you're going to violate the regulations to wind up with a violation. Any activity that actually violates the regs could result in a penalty under that strict liability regime. So that's part of the reason why you have to put a solid data security plan in place, because any release, whether it's to a foreign national in the United States domestically, whether it's inadvertent or willful or whatever, could result in a penalty under the regulation.
And we mentioned this a couple of times during the presentation, but the primary responsibility for ensuring compliance with the ITAR remains with the data owner. And people tackle this in different ways, but it always starts with contractual agreements and contractual protections, and then layering on additional measures such as auditing and other requirements.
Great, thank you. Next question goes to Gerry. How does tokenization differ from encryption?
You know, I touched on this a bit in the presentation. It's interesting. You know, some forms of tokenization don't differ very much from encryption. I mentioned before there's different ways to create tokens. Some use what's called a one-way hash or a mathematical approach. So those are, I think, closer cousins to encryption. Encryption is the idea that there's an original value, then there's a key, and then ciphertext gets created, and the key, an algorithm, and then there's a key to bring the ciphertext back into the original form. Tokenization, as we've implemented it inside of Perspecsys, is a much more sort of random assignment or creation of a token to the original value. And as I mentioned, our submission to the State Department really focused on a lot of the virtues of tokenization. We didn't really discuss much on the encryption front, because the idea that was the catalyst for us was that, hey, this is in some ways very similar to a problem that we've been solving around the world for many organizations under this umbrella of data sovereignty, or data residency, and the various regimes in these different countries, compliance regulatory groups had been investigating tokenization and encryption, and they really felt like tokenization was much more aligned with the spirit of the requirements on these data residency approaches, which is why we chose that as the focus of our submission into the DDTC.
Great, thanks, Gerry. Next question is probably for both teams. So based on the rule of sufficient means, can the gateway reside in the overseas facility of a U.S. company?
I mean, Gerry, maybe it's more of a technical question. I mean, the token vault would not be able to reside in an overseas location, and no clear text ITAR data in any form would be able to reside in the foreign location. You know, how you configure specific
that's what I was thinking about as well. We do have situations. I think the question is spot on in the sense that there is a way to segregate basically data locations of the data location from gateway locations. So while we'd have to explore it more with the particular customer and what the infrastructure looks like and where the cloud locations are, et cetera, there is the opportunity where the token vault might be in one location, the gateway located in another. So technically, it doesn't need to be one way or the other, but per your comment, the token vault needs to remain in the United States.
Next question, is it possible to have more than one server for data residency? In our example, we have multiple manufacturing sites, for example, in Switzerland, UK, and the US.
And so, yes, so the answer is yes. We have many organizations that are using Perspecsys in different countries with specific data residency requirements. A couple that come to mind. One global company that we're supporting, there's 7 or 8 countries, each with their own specific data requirements on what needs to stay inside the geographic border, but it's a US-based cloud. So, long story short, yes, and it's a pretty common issue that we're helping people out with for more, global players. So.
Next question for the Kelley Drye team. How do I make sure my data does not go to countries that are prohibited under the license exemption?
Yes, that's really a contractual issue that you're going to have to sort out with your cloud provider. So you need to make sure you build in place an agreement with the provider that your data is not going to be located in any of the prohibited locations. And it's really important that you get solid assurance from the provider and make sure they understand why that requirement's in place and why it's important. And, as part of what we do for people in helping them implement their export compliance program is to allocate risk properly through agreements like that. So the cloud provider would need to take on the responsibility and the risk for making sure that happens properly to the greatest possible extent. Rob talked about the owner of the data being responsible, but there are ways to do some risk allocation in this process.
Great, thanks. And it looks like we have time for one more question. Gerry, this one's for you. At what point is the value replaced with a token, and how does it prevent an issue with data in transit?
Sure. So I think it solves the data in transit issue given the way that customers deploy our gateway. There's 2 ways to deploy. There is the idea of it being inside of your own data center, which I think would be, which is the situation in ITAR controlled situations. And in that situation, the tokenization process occurs inside of that company's data center. So the token, anything that leaves that firewall of the organization is the replacement token. And the process of bringing the information back into the clear text or the original value occurs only inside of that firewall on the way back in. There are deployments in countries where Perspecsys is run as a managed service for organizations. So Canada, Australia, the UK, and soon a few other countries where the challenge or the requirement is more about the data not crossing a border as opposed to it having to be necessarily in my own data center. Larger managed service providers can provide a local data residency as a service, for lack of a better phrase, where this approach can be run to ensure the data stays inside of a certain geographic border.
Great. Thanks, Gerry, and really appreciate everyone joining the webcast today. Just as a reminder, you'll receive a copy of the presentation and the recording within 2 business days. Thank you and have a great day.